Oh, welcome everyone, and welcome people online. Welcome to the WRI's Water and Health Seminar Series, which today we are featuring Anne Jefferson and microplastics. And I'm going to bring up one of her students who works with her on microplastics to introduce. So thank you very much.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the 5th presentation in the Water Resource Institute's Water Connects Water and Health Seminar Series. During this seminar series, we are looking to highlight research and connections between water and health. My name is Nur Jahan and I'm a grad student at the University of Vermont. I'm very excited to introduce today's talk by Anne Jefferson with UVM's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources titled Rivers of Plastic, Connecting Local Pollution Dynamics to a Planetary Health Challenge. Anne is a watershed hydrologist and geomorphologist dedicated to understanding and improving water resources and aquatic ecosystems in the Anthropocene. Her interdisciplinary research spans urban watersheds, stormwater management, and plastic pollution, integrating field data, laboratory analysis, numerical modeling, and collaboration across social sciences and engineering. As the Robert F. and Genevieve B. Patrick Endowed Chair in Watershed Science and Planning at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, she directs several key programs, including the Vermont Water Resources and Lake Studies Center and the Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Anne's work also explores the impacts of climate change on snowpacks and flood regimes, emphasizing science communication and public engagement. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Consortium of Universities for the Advancement of Hydrologic Sciences, Inc., where she chaired the board in 2024. This talk will about 40 minutes with 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Please hold your questions until the end. Welcome to our remote guests. If you are joining, I will turn the floor over to Anne.
Right. Thanks, Anne, for the nice introduction, and thanks to WRI for inviting me here. I really enjoyed the conversation we just had informally before the talk, because usually my title slides something about trash and often says something about talking trash, but we're going to go with a slightly different spin today. I had to come up with this title for Hannah several months ago and try to fit the water and health theme. But my goal today is going to be to really kind of connect what we see and are experiencing locally in the Burlington area and in other US cities with a broader set of global issues that are, of course, then also related to planetary health and human health. And I have to say, I've been at UVM just about 3 years now, and I can't, and we're a very green state, and I work on urban problems. We're not a notably urban state. And I also was kind of at the beginning phases of this NSF funded project on trash. And I thought, and I think this was several interview questions, but I sort of thought, what am I gonna do if I get to Burlington and we don't have urban problems and we don't have trash? And then after I agreed to take the job, and I was staying in an Airbnb in Winooski, we walked down to the Winooski River, and it's a little pixelated on the screen, but I felt much better when I saw the trash in the Winooski River, because I said, okay, there's something here I can work with. And I will say that just out of frame on this slide, you would find at that time, because I have other pictures, a basketball, a red Solo cup, and a bicycle wheel, right? So like, just to sort of start with, what we're talking about here is really the refuse of our daily lives around the world. And just to kind of drag that home, it's not just that one spot in Winooski on the Winooski River, but this is Potash Brook. We've got lots of tires in Potash Brook. This is the Stevens branch of the Winooski up in Barrie. And this is like in incredibly rural Vermont, near East Calais. We found, one of those disposable, or well, it turns out to be disposable, but one of those folding camping chairs that probably has a nice synthetic fabric seat that has ended up in this rural river. So it turns out, so our watershed lab is my research group at UVM, and you can see maybe see the shopping cart in our logo, because after a while you start to kind of see the human signal in all of our problems, and that includes thinking about trash and plastic pollution. And so kind of the setup I'm going to use today is that plastics are a planetary, ecological, and human health problem. So I'm going to start by acknowledging the scope of this problem and making the connection to human health. And then I'm going to get back to where I'm really much more comfortable and familiar, which is to say that in order to understand this problem, we have to understand the sources, pathways, and sinks in the environment. And that's really where our group's focus has been. All right, so what is the scale of this problem that I've just claimed is planetary? So this comes from a UN assessment in 2021. And what we're seeing here is the rise of plastic production. So plastics really weren't a thing before the 1950s, and they've been growing much like our greenhouse gas emissions have ever since. And of course, plastics are a petroleum-based product. It's the same petrochemical industry that is creating our plastics pollution problem as is driving our greenhouse gas emissions fundamentally. When we think about plastics, most of the plastics ever produced have been, more than half of them have been discarded. Many of the plastics that we use every day are single-use or short lifetime plastics. When we are done with them, we throw them away. Maybe we try to recycle them, but even in the US, less than 10% of plastics get recycled. Worldwide, it's something like 7% of the total plastics ever produced have been recycled. And there are some real, this isn't just a social issue, there are some real technological and sort of fundamental challenges with the recyclability of plastics. And so, and we can incinerate some, but we're really going to be kind of over here in this piece of the pile of what happens to the plastics that we're not using anymore. And some of those have the potential to get out into the environment. And specifically, we're thinking about aquatic ecosystems, right? So this graph, which looks disturbingly like climate change projections, is in fact projections of plastic emissions to all aquatic ecosystems. So that's oceans and freshwater. I don't think you can see the pointer, so you're gonna, I'll just walk back and forth. So this is based on 2015 data and, you know, kind of following the trend of this curve, in that we're having the yellow bar is our business as usual scenario. And what you should notice is that in 2015, we were releasing 20 million tons of plastic to aquatic ecosystems. And by 2030, which is really not very far from now, it's 60 tons, so a tripling in the space of 15 years, which matches this rapid increase that we have in plastic production. The blue bar is in this paper what they consider an ambitious plastic waste reduction scheme, and you'll notice that even with that, which we are not on trend to do, it still goes up. And then the purple is sort of the unachievable, acknowledged by the authors, but it's trying to get down to this orange line, which is 8 million tons a year of plastics, which ocean scientists have said is an unacceptable level of plastic pollution in ocean marine ecosystems, right? So there is a pathway to get there. It's extremely unlikely. We're not on track to do it. And that's just thinking about oceans, whereas this is thinking about all aquatic ecosystems. So we are talking about really big problems here that are really fundamentally tied to the way we use materials in the 21st century, right? And our options at the end of life of those materials. Again, just stick with like 20 megatons increasing to like, we've probably doubled this, right? We're probably producing 40 megatons of plastics into the aquatic environment. Why does that matter? This is the one slide, this is closest we're going to get to human health. There is a lot of both ecological and human impacts of plastic pollution. So this side of the diagram is focused on marine ecosystems, because again, I'm borrowing from a report focused on marine systems, but this all can be thought of as impacts in freshwater systems as well. So we have sort of problems with entanglement and ingestion. We have problems with economic impacts. We have, of course, nobody really wants to hang out with a lot of trash in the environment. So that has mental health impacts, it has economic impacts, so societal impacts. That's just from the big plastics. If we get then down into microplastics, of course, we have more problems with ingestion in things like drinking water or filter feeders. We have lots of problems with chemicals and additives. It's not so much the carbon in molecules in the plastic itself. It's all the things like the flame retardants and the plasticizers and the endocrine disruptors that we add to plastics that are causing impact. And then this is kind of bringing it down to the scale of our bodies. And so thinking about our exposure to microplastics, and I've cut off, but you can find it online, all the things that we think it's doing, right? And this is including crossing barriers into the placenta, right? Crossing the blood-brain barrier. This is not the scope that I work in. There are fantastic other people working in this space, but for the context of like, when I'm talking about, you know, microplastics on Lake Champlain beaches or in Potash Brook or in other places, it's in this context of there are thousands and thousands of fantastic researchers learning every day more about the environmental and human health consequences of this sort of plastic miasma that we're all living in and in our environment. And I'll just say from a personal level, if you care about plastics, you've probably thought about like your plastics around what you're eating in terms of plastics, but just stick with the fact that like we're actually just breathing in a lot of plastics all the time, and there's very little we can do about that in terms of changing our food containers, right? Okay, so still from the same UN report, they have this really nice diagram of sort of sources and pathways of plastics to the marine environment, okay? And so we have cities as sources, and we have landfills as sources, and roads and traffic as sources, and sewage and wastewater as sources. And we could get into a lot of detail in that space. I'm not gonna go there today. My work has been more focused over on this side of the slide and thinking about pathways and storage zones, and specifically looking at rivers, and then now lakes, and the sediments at river margins and lake margins, and thinking about how our rivers and lakes are delivering plastics, how they're transforming plastics, and then where they're storing plastics, often but not always in the sediment. This, I don't know if you can read it, it says an estimated 4.8 to 12.7 million tons per year of macroplastics from rivers to the marine environment. That's a big range of numbers. We really struggle as a scientific field to get a better plastics flux to the marine environment from rivers. And that number is a lot higher than most of the numbers you'll see, which are in the 0.4 to 4 million tons a year from rivers to the marine environment. But again, we are really struggling as a field to get a good handle on these fluxes. We know that most of the plastics in the marine environment are coming from shore-based sources, and then it's partitioning that into the rivers versus direct coastal inputs that gets really challenging. So people have tried to do that by looking at population centers relatively near the coast, and then how good the waste management is in different regions. And so this is one attempt to do this. So the circles of various colors represent rivers, and they're modeled plastic fluxes into the ocean. And what you'll see is this concentration of colorful dots, particularly in Southeast Asia. And that represents very large near coastal populations that have poor access to appropriate waste management. And so there's a lot of problems with dumping or with things being on the street and washed in. That's not where I'm gonna focus today. I'm actually gonna bring us over here to this part of the map that looks pretty good. And say that actually the US produces more plastic waste than any other country in the world. We also produce more plastic waste per person than any other country in the world. And while we have really good waste management, we do still end up with plastics in the environment. So I showed you some river pictures a moment ago. This is the McDonald's beach in Plattsburgh, but we've got plastics here and here. And there's a big 55-gallon plastic barrel in the background, right? So some of what we're not seeing in the US is because a lot of the US is draining into rivers and lakes a long way from the ocean before it gets to the ocean, or potentially it's being stored more locally before it gets out to the ocean. So we have better waste management, but we also have all these stores that get missed on maps like this. And again, if we're struggling with maps like this, we're really struggling with the more local scale fluxes and sinks of plastics in the environment. Okay, so this is as close as I'm gonna get to kind of the sources, but just to help you build this mental picture of how we're getting all of these millions of tons of plastic into the environment. Before the talk, we were talking about the problems with trash day. And this is one that kind of breaks my heart because it's like the homeowner here, the resident has done everything right, and then the garbage truck loses it, right? And it flows into the environment. But we also have dumping. We have a lot of potential plastic coming in from storm drains. We have things being blown in, and it may be things that are happening quite a ways from the stream, or it may be things that are quite proximal to the stream. But our streams serve as these sort of arteries draining the urban landscape, and therefore our urban streams in particular are significant in terms of moving plastics at both the local and then draining into larger waterways. So the research that my group's been doing since 2020 has really been looking at how rivers, lakes, and shorelines act as transporters, transformers, and stores of plastic pollution. Our work started out and has largely been focused on what we'd call macroplastics. So those are things greater, depending on who you ask, than at least 25 millimeters, or for much of our work, we've used a definition of 5 centimeters as a minimum size. So things like plastic bags, plastic bottles, straws, all the way up to like, I don't know, those basketball hoops that people have at the end of the driveway. We've seen those in streams. But there are also smaller plastics. So this is a picture of some mesoplastics that are not quite small enough to be microplastics yet, but they're still bigger. These are what we would call secondary plastics in the environment. And if they get small enough, they'll be secondary microplastics. So you can see, one of the things I like about this picture is you can see what these used to be part of bigger things, right? Like part of a spoon, part of a cigar or cigarillo, part of the cap of a Coke bottle, right? And so they've ended up in the environment broken down from these larger objects. Microplastics are defined as less than 5 millimeters or less than about the size of a pencil eraser. So we can get secondary microplastics broken down from larger plastics, but we also have primary microplastics. And a relevant one there are these plastic pellets or nurdles. These are actually the raw material for everything else in the picture. This is what's shipped from the petrochemical companies to your local plastic bottle manufacturer, right? Melted down and then often extruded into the plastics that we use every day. But these too can leak into the environment, and they are something that we see as a problem both globally and regionally. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about rivers and this project that we've called our Trashy Streams project. And I want to acknowledge the many people who have picked up trash out of streams with me, including over 24 undergrads across multiple different universities. Fundamentally, we're interested in how land use and channel form influence trash accumulation, and we might think about that as both transport and storage of trash in streams. And then what happens to the trash after it's in the stream, and that gets to kind of the transformation, that breakdown from big to little piece, and also storage. And I'm gonna start really local because I'm trying to like bring the local here. So this is Potash Brook. This is I-89 curving through here, the airport up here, the mall, Target, Hannaford's here. We have sampled 4 reaches in the stream 5 times each in the summers of 2024 and 2025. So this is the Kennedy Drive and Route 2 intersection. This is Heinsberg Road, this is the Miller Farm, and this is the Spear Street dip under 189, just to orient you to the map. Any guesses on which one is the trashiest? Spear Street. I will say the undergrads that I presented to last week knew the answer. So it's actually the one, it's this one just downstream of the mall and the Hannafords. And this is a 42% impervious surface little sub watershed of Potash Brook here, which is about as urban as we tend to get before we start burying streams with really heavy development just upstream of 89. So what we did at these reach surveys is we went out initially the beginning of the summer, we stretched out a 30-meter tape, and we noted the locations and characteristics of each piece of trash that we encountered in the stream. And then we kind of said, it's okay, we're gonna leave it for the purposes of science, and we didn't take it out. And we came back after at least one storm, usually several weeks later, and we redid our survey. So our data might look like, yeah, the sock's still here, but now there's this plastic ball that's arrived, maybe your traffic cone has moved some, and the water bottle that was in our reach is now totally gone. And from that, we're calculating kind of a trash budget and looking at the characteristics of trash that is more and less mobile. So we just finished our 2025 data collection. We had to wait for it to start raining again. We just finished that last week, so I'm not gonna show you any results, and this is just the very first cut on 2024. But across our 4 reaches, we have 300 unique pieces of trash over the course of the summer. Not necessarily all at once, but if you do the math, that's multiple pieces of trash per meter in Burlington. And our downstream of the mall in I-89 was the trashiest, with lots of plastic food wrappers. That's the most common thing there overall. But across our 4 reaches, the most common item was plastic bags. So despite Vermont's bag ban reducing shopping bags by 91%, we are still finding ways to get plastic bags into the environment and into streams. And the trash is pretty mobile. So we had about over half moving between visits, and if you propagate that out over the course of 5 visits each summer, you might have something like less than 10% of trash was stationary for the whole summer. So this trash is on the move, and we know with this method that we're missing trash that just floats through and doesn't get stuck or doesn't stay there long enough for us to come back and resurvey. What does this look like? So these are just the sorts of field data photos that we were collecting. These are all from the Miller Farm reach. So we have a portion of a plastic cup, we have a wrapper, another wrapper, a piece of foam. I really love this blue plastic ring that has ringed a stick, right? We have some sort of plastic label. So many of the pieces of trash that we're finding are quite small because we were really trying to go as small as we could see, but there are some larger ones. This is not the only milk crate we saw in this reach in 2 years. And then our last data collection, this wallet turned up on the stream bed. This wallet is amazing because the IDs in the wallet expired in 2011. So this wallet wasn't dumped in the stream in 2025, because why would you do that? This wallet has been hanging out someplace in the Potash Brook watershed for close to 15 years, and then it's reemerged. And that starts to hint at some of the storage of trash that we think is important and undercounted within fluvial corridors, okay? So this is streams as transporters, but also starting to think about streams as at least transient storage of trash in the environment. That was not the first work we did. So sort of backing up in time, our project started in Cleveland and Charlotte in 2021. We were really interested in thinking about the predictors of trash in different stream reaches. So we had 24 different stream reaches across the 2 cities, and in each reach, which was about 200 meters long, we wanted to collect all the trash initially, and completely that's not possible in a reasonable time frame, and to collect all the data. So instead, we established 4 to 6 transects per reach. We did a lot of geomorphic measurements of cross sections, long profiles, and sediments, and then we carefully inventoried each piece of trash with at least a long dimension greater than 5 centimeters within 2 meters of our transect. We didn't just count it, but we made notes about what it was and where it was and what it was touching. And then we did a whole bunch of GIS analysis for each of the watersheds, for each of our stream reaches. In each city, we built both single linear and multiple linear regression models. And in both cities, the strongest single linear relationship was with a geomorphic variable, although we did also have good GIS predictors, they just weren't quite as strong. And so this really speaks to the value of geomorphology in predicting trash retention or accumulation in reaches, and also part of why previous models that have only used land cover or other human dimensions haven't done a very good job of predicting trash within stream reaches. We found that when we combined geomorphology and GIS-derived variables, we were able to build very strong predictive models, suggesting, of course, that it is both humans and the natural environment that are controlling trash storage. I want to talk about our 2 best predictors. So in Cleveland, we saw a strong negative relationship with channel width. In other words, wider channels have lower trash concentrations. And the story of this takeout container kind of exemplifies why. So we're standing in the field. It's a beautiful sunny day, as it looks like. We're downstream of a shopping mall in a parking area on a busy road. And this container comes floating by, and it's just floating downstream. And then it kind of bumps into these rocks at the edge of the river. And it hangs out there for a little while, and then it goes down, and then it bumps into the edge of the channel again, and then I just can't handle it anymore, and I pull it out, right? But it had the opportunity to bump into the edge of the channel because this is a fairly narrow channel. You can see that's a COVID face mask. There has been carried and caught on the edge of the channel. Now contrast that if those objects had fallen into the middle of this much, much wider stream, the chances that they are going to interact with the channel margin and get entangled or caught up in the roughness on the channel margin are lower. So that's why we think the channel width is an important control on accumulation and storage of trash. It's kind of a similar logic for what we saw in Charlotte, which is that reaches with more variable widths had higher trash concentrations. So what we think is happening here is that when there's more variable width, you have zones of constriction where flow is kind of coming together and maybe forced against the channel margin, the green circles. And then you have wide spots that produce eddies and maybe sort of stagnant areas that that heavier trash may settle out, or that lighter trash may continue to float and hang out as storm flows go down. So that's kind of the amount of trash and trash in bulk. It's not just plastic, but we then were interested in kind of getting into more details of the trash data set. So this waffle plot, each box represents, I think, 5 or 10 pieces of trash, and all of the purple and orange is plastic, and all the other colors are all non-plastic items. So more than 2/3 of the trash that we collected in our surveys are plastic related items. So purple is non-foamed, and orange is foamed plastic, so like styrofoam, right? Expanded polystyrene. We went back to Cleveland in 2024 to a subset of reaches. We got a lot less plastic because we had fewer reaches. There was also a plastic bag ban that happened in the meantime. We got a lot more non-plastic, we got a lot more concrete and brick, and we don't think it's because a lot of brick and concrete dumping happened in Cleveland in 3 years. It's that I know that my team and I undercounted in 2021, but I didn't tell Andrea to ignore all the concrete and brick in 2024. So we also do have a legacy of non-plastic materials in some areas. Looking at our data set as a whole, as I said, we characterized it. We developed a flexibility scale from I can't bend it at all to I could tie it in a knot. And so most of our materials that we found in the streams were highly flexible. Most of them were not wholly. They were sort of solid films or solid materials. And most of them were not complete items. We then took all of this information along with sort of the types of item it was when we could tell and the dimensions, and we ran a cluster analysis on the characteristics of the trash, and we came up with 17 morphospecies. So think about like a species, but now this is just based on the morphological characteristics. Of those species, 11 of them are plastics. Right? And we see plastic food container represented in multiple species. And then we see 4 species of plastic bags at varying states of degradation. And we have a couple foam species as well. And we see them across our 24 reaches. We see them in almost all reaches, where as our non-plastic species were a little bit less widely distributed. The plastic bags set of species comprises almost 30% of our data set. So plastic bags are just a really ubiquitous problem. We then did the same thing with all of the data about where the trash was located in the stream. We created microhabitat clusters, which I've illustrated with this cartoon. And then we looked at the distribution of each of our morphospecies across morphohabitats. And what we see is that the plastics get everywhere. But they are particularly common in microhabitats characterized by vegetation and wood. And the one place where we don't see a lot, so I should say the size and the intensity of the blue dots represents the number of individuals of a species in a given habitat. So the one place we see kind of smaller dots or absence of dots on this graph is subaerial bars where there isn't vegetation or wood. And what we think is happening there is that any plastics that are deposited, they don't get entangled with anything like they do around the vegetation and wood. And then they either blow off the bar into some other part of the stream, or when the water rises again, they float away and end up trapped someplace else. If we were looking at this graph for our non-plastic materials, we'd see our non-plastics to be much more specialized and kind of hanging out in the channel bottoms and on the bars. So we get different distributions depending on our morphospecies. But plastics are everywhere, and usually with wood and vegetation. We took all of our species and then reach scale characteristics, and we looked at associations between our reach scale characteristics and our distributions of trash, and we see some differences show up across our free city data sets, but we are able now to see a little bit more about the physical controls versus the development controls. So bankful width and our variation in width and sinuosity are more highly associated with species that are heavier, although the variation in width is related to plastic bag species. And then the development indicators tell us more about plastic bags and bottles and foam, more highly associated that way. So with different drivers driving different types of trash in the streams and where it accumulates. Okay, so as we were doing this, we were also noting whether there was any deposition, erosion, or burial associated with each piece of trash. And we saw, particularly in Charlotte, where there are sand bed streams, we noted a significant number of pieces of trash that had deposition associated with it, less in the gravel cobble streams in Cleveland. We didn't see a lot of erosion, And most of the trash items that we found were not buried. That's the open part of the bar, but some percentage of them were at least partially buried. So this is 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and 75 to 100% buried. But we also saw things like this. So it's 2 shopping carts, same creek. This shopping cart, really easy to notice. This shopping cart we walked by 4 times before we saw the wheels sticking out. And sure enough, when we kind of pawed away at it, there's a whole shopping cart down there in the stream bed, right? So we anecdotally think that this data set was probably undercounting things that were mostly and certainly completely buried because we just didn't see them as we were doing the work. And this got me interested in the timescales of burial for trash in streams. So we set up some sites in Cleveland. We didn't put the trash there. We took advantage of the natural experiment, but we used trail cameras and repeat topographic surveys to look at geomorphic change in the presence of large trash over the course of 2 years. And we, this is our unholy amalgamation of a hot water heater, the side of a kid's plastic log cabin, and the sort of plastic wheelie bin or trash can that you put out at the end of your driveway, right? And this is what it looked like when we started monitoring. This is what it looked like a year in. And over time, we had 20 centimeters of burial of this entire thing, right? So you wouldn't know it was there now. And this is at the top of a bar. So we're still working on getting all the graphics pretty, but our repeat total station surveys bear this out. We also looked at multiple shopping carts and the base of a lamppost and a concrete pipe and what they were doing over time. The concrete pipe rolled, but the lamppost and the shopping carts mostly stayed stationary and tended towards burial, again, underscoring the potential for sort of large scale storage or sequestration of even large trash, not to mention small trash, over relatively rapid periods within the streams. The last thing I will say about streams is this idea of them as transformers. We've been focused on large trash, but if you remember back to my pictures of Potash Brook, there were a lot of little fragments of things. This is a gap in what we've done so far. We haven't really looked at the breakdown of materials or the generation of microplastics from macroplastics, and it's one of the places I want to head next. But in Cleveland, we had a little bit of a taste of this because they put a plastic bag ban into force in 2022, and that's why we went back in 2024. So if we look at our data from the same stream reaches from before the ban and after the ban, we see a significant decline in plastic bags, and we don't see that for other types of materials. What's even more interesting is when we look at our morpho species, we see some real differences across morpho species. So species 12 is like fresh plastic bags that are, if not complete, they're pretty complete and they're not porous, right? We don't think of plastic bags as having pores, but species 13 and 14 are porous plastic bags. And that when we pulled them out and we held them up, we're like, yeah, there's holes in that thing. This is complete, but with holes, and incomplete, but holes. And species 15 is so degraded that when we try to extract them from the stream bed or from the vegetation, they would just fall apart into fragments, right? And so following the plastic bag ban, we see less of the fresh plastic bags, but an equal amount of degraded plastic bags, but then a loss of the most weathered, most degraded species. And so we think that if we went back in like 2027, we'd see this distribution shift even further, and we'd see more of the really degraded, and then maybe by 2030 we'll have fewer plastic bags in Cleveland, right? So we know, and this picture down here is showing plastic bags kind of wrapped around tree roots. We know that these are likely generating microplastics as they degrade in the environment, but there's nobody's really studied this, so there's more work to be done, which is my transition. We're going to go really fast through Lake Champlain microplastics. My transition to talking about how big plastics become little plastics through environmental processes, sometimes mediated and accelerated by microbes, and they break down into these secondary microplastics. So all the images on these slides are from Nurjahans and they're beach samples from Lake Champlain, but you can imagine how something like this was once a plastic bag, right? And now it's a microplastic on the surface of Lake Champlain. So with funding from the Basin Program, Nurjahan and Grace and other undergrads have been looking at the distribution of plastic on Lake Champlain beaches and trying to understand hotspots of plastic accumulation. Where we haven't gotten to yet is why and what's driving this, but that's the plan for the rest of Nurjahan's degree. So again, beaches are acting as storage zones for plastics. In 2024, we ran transects along the low or active strand line of 6 different beaches. And so color heat map here, darker colors represent higher concentrations. We see our 3 Burlington beaches, Leddy, North, and Oakledge, have higher concentrations of plastics of more diverse morphologies than our more rural Shelburne, Sandbar, and Alberg beaches, kind of the same pattern in the New York data that there's more plastics around Plattsburgh than there is farther away. But this sampling exposed a real flaw in our sampling because this isn't where the plastics really end up and hang out. So in November, Nurjahan and others went out and they resampled multiple zones on North Beach and Oakledge, looking at that low active strand line where we had been sampling, the high strand line, and at the back of the beach where the vegetation is. And you can see that there's a lot more plastics at the back of the beach than there is down by the water line, at least by the end of the summer. So we know from our own sampling and from the literature, and just from our observations that summer where we'd collect a sample that looked really good and then we'd walk over a bunch of plastic on our way up to the top of the beach, that the plastics that we were missing, plastics left by visitors, plastics that are blown to the back of the beach, which can happen because they're so light, and then plastics left by high wave events. So this is Charlottetown Beach in May, and we've got a really nice developed strand line here. The water level's high. As the summer goes on and the water levels drop, Charlotte gets a little bit more of a beach, and that strand line is preserved, but it's not what we were sampling, right? And so in 2025, we changed our sampling patterns so that we could sample these 3 different zones at each beach. And we're frantically and carefully and meticulously analyzing the samples now so that we can come back in a couple of years and give an update at the end of the story. But we also ran transects to look for visible plastics across size classes, not just at our high intensity sampling beaches, but actually at 35 beaches around the lake. This was what our team, our field team, Nurjahan and Grace, could see, at least at like the hands and knees scale at the surface. And what I want to point out here is that in almost every beach we sampled, we found fragments, but we also found foam. And that was something that we almost completely missed in 2024, but it's super pervasive all around Lake Champlain beaches. It looks like this. We are not the first people to say Lake Champlain has a foam problem. In fact, we are behind the advocacy organizations that have been saying this for years. And so it's been a privilege to work with the NOAA-funded Marine Debris Coalition that's working on educating and cleanups in this space as well. So just to draw a bow on it, again, thinking about these really large scale problems, but bringing my geomorphology, hydrology insights into thinking about sources, pathways, and sinks. So we have plastics that are mostly highly mobile, but we know that we're missing some of the story in terms of actually being able to get better flux estimates. We know that streams have the potential to act as transformers and generate secondary microplastics, but there's a real research gap there that needs to be filled. We know that streams are storing plastic, both by entanglement along channel margins and burial in stream beds and floodplains. I'm going to talk about it today. But we don't know how much plastic is stored in our streams, right? And so it's kind of like a missing link in our accounting. And then same thing with shorelines, and there's been a lot of work done on like marine shorelines and a lot less work done on freshwater shorelines in terms of connections between sources and then the storage dynamics happening on the shorelines. So that's what we'll be continuing to do. And with that, I will take questions. Oh, and I forgot to pass around my samples. So these are fresh made microplastics from Plattsburgh City Beach, picked up by Beacon Town 7th graders earlier this fall. So don't spill it. Kitty.
Is the wallet with the ID, was it a local ID to that area, or was it from somewhere
You'd
else?
have to ask Andrea, but she did find a person that had some Vermont connection with that name on Facebook, and she was going to try to figure out how to offer them their wallets back. It's very gross, actually. But that tells you about the sticking power of plastics, in that the IDs were readable quite some time later, right? Despite being totally caked in mud.
This is a really fun presentation. Thanks for doing it. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, like, and for you, probably doing a lot of the field work, it's daunting to think about wrapping your head around quantifying this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what you all have learned over time about how to like wrap your hands around this. And I was also kind of wondering about the potential of UAS, like drone surveys running upstreams and doing some kind of image detection work to simplify.
Yeah, multiple elements to that. So for microplastics, the field work's the easy part, and the sample debt you accrue every time you bring a bunch of beach sand back to the lab is like many hours, right? Because we're sieving it and we're visually pulling out the plastic pieces, and then Nurjahan's doing the microscope work, and then we're bringing it to the FTIR to get the polymer and all the characters. So it's like, I can't even tell you how many hours of work it is per sample. The trash work is a lot more field work and then just cleaning up the data. But so that makes some of these issues of needing to scale up the data collection and analysis to really answer these questions very challenging, because there just aren't like high throughput methods. We did think about using drones for topographic change detection, but there were some like permitting and logistical issues. But there are folks not using drones so much, but bridge mounted cameras to look at floating plastics. And that has some potential, but we know that some plastics are going to be neutrally buoyant or even carried down near the bed. And then of course that doesn't help you with the smaller things. And we've also deployed our trail cameras. We thought we'd get some plastic fluxes off our trail cameras, but like your image quality goes down a lot when it's raining. And if it's raining at night, you really can't see what's happening. So you sort of get before the big event and after the big event, and you've missed the things moving through the camera. So it's great for like sunny weather, low flow sort of detection, but not so good for wet weather detection. So people are doing things like net sampling from bridges, but that is also really hard to do in high flows and only giving you access to a small portion of the stream at any given time. So there's some real challenges on all sides of the work. Yeah. Allison, I saw you had a question.
Yeah, you're just kind of thinking like, must be considering cycles of drought and flooding, especially around here, and how that affects movement of plastics. I mean, I'm just imagining all the rivers.
Yeah.
After recent flooding and trash up in the trees,
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a really challenging thing. And it points to some of the really hard societal problem piece of this, because with the flooding, there's a lot of plastic and trash in the rivers that nobody intended to get in there. They might have done all the right things, but when half of your house is now in the river, like that brings a lot of trash with it. In the aftermath of the 2023 and 2024 floods, it would have been great to get out and kind of quantify that. But as you know, people immediately start getting into the rivers and pulling stuff out and clean, and it's a very challenging environment to sensitively go in and think about how do we do data collection that isn't going to provide immediate value to the community. So we haven't done that work. However, Potash Brook, inadvertently, we now have a drought year and a flood year so it'll be interesting to look at fluxes under those two different sets of conditions. And we have, thanks to Suvian, we have flow data as well, so we can also think about how things are changing versus various amounts of elapsed flow.
Do you think there'd be ways to use something to kind of like scan beds to see if there might be stuff under? Like I was just thinking like with the shopping carts, like they're usually not 100% plastic, there's usually metal, and like would metal detection help you find plastics as well, or like how do you find when it's buried essentially?
So metal detection isn't going to help us find plastics unless there's a lot of metal.
They don't like get buried together ever, like usually.
They kind of segregate in different places in the channel. You know, I do think that there is potential for the metallic things, or to identify dumping zones, like in rivers and lakes. The people that are magnet fishing, right? Like we were out at the Brookfield floating bridge earlier this fall, and there was a woman just repeatedly throwing a magnet on a rock string off the bridge. And I was like, do you ever catch anything? She was telling me about all the fishing gear and all the other things, bicycles that she caught, right? So there are people that, like, there are ways that we can do some of what you're talking about. In terms of like, I mean, I think a lot about the need to core and to like sort of poke lots of, it's because my training is actually as a hydrogeologist in part, right? Poke lots of holes in the ground and see what we come up with, right? And so one of the many things I would like to do is more stream bed coring and floodplain coring, to think about this. And we certainly know that, I didn't talk about any floodplain work here, but we have floodplain data from one stream in Cleveland and stream data to go with it, coring. And yes, there are plastics into the beds of the streams and floodplains. But also if you go down or you go in the right places, you get historic dumping grounds and you get a lot of non-plastic trash in these environments. You know, we've pulled spoons and old bottles and really old electrical things out of stream banks as well. So, dumping into streams and into the environment is not a new problem in any way. It's the vast volume of what we're doing now and the sort of toxic materials that go with the plastics that make it a particular concern. So shopping carts, I tend to actually kind of like in streams. They're one of the things that can create sort of habitat complexity, and they retain organic material and they kind of function a little bit like a mini wood jam. And they're mostly metal. And if we start digging them all out of the streams, then we're really bioturbating that bed, potentially destabilizing a bank. There's a stream in Cleveland that we've been studying where one or more stores just dumped literally thousands of shopping carts on the floodplain, and they've been washing downstream ever since. And the Land Conservancy group used to do a lot of cleanups where they'd pull shopping carts out of the stream and out of the floodplain. And what they realized is they were actually destroying the floodplain because they were pulling so much of this material out. And so they're now in place. So it's sort of like having a floodplain full of gabion baskets, right? Like it's kind of the same idea, but tires have a lot of toxic chemicals in them. Those I think are a little bit more worth digging out of streams. Yeah.
Maybe this is what your paper is going to be about. But it seems like for geomorphology, usually in the built environment, we hear about how it's the infrastructure that drives these geomorphic changes. What is that going to show? And do you think in your work that there is an argument to be made that the things we just put there by accident also are geomorphic drivers? And
yeah, shopping carts. The shopping carts are exciting. And yeah, we have, and I didn't put the slides in, but I should have, because I always put them out, but then I want to tell people about it. We had a shopping cart we were monitoring, and like a 2-year flow went through the entire channel, shifted and made scour holes, except that the shopping cart was sitting on a pillar of sediment and that was retained and it never moved, right? So it acted as this like stabilizing force for the channel in ways that are completely like novel and cool, and we don't see that with natural materials, right? And we saw same reach, we saw wood jam blow out, that had 3 shopping carts embedded in it, only one moved and got tangled up with the new wood jam location. The other 2 are holding on to large amounts of sediment in the stream and maybe kind of anchoring the bar that had built up behind the wood jam at this point. So yeah, I do think they have geomorphic effects. That's why I wrote the proposal then for 2020. And it's been an interesting story of what we can and can't quantify, actually.
How persistent do you think that unholy combination is gonna be?
Let's go, I mean, until, yeah, it's just there. You know?
Yeah.
It's also under, oh, what is that really invasive multiflora rose?
Mm.
So, you know, like
Yeah.
there's a lot of impacts on these streams, but like that was, originally we were gonna dig everything out, but it's actually quite a ways to haul some of this stuff out. And again, we started to think about all the sort of ecosystem disruption, the potential like spread of invasive species we'd be doing if we started digging this stuff out. So I think it's there until there's a large flood that moves the bar wholesale. But the park district knows it's there because they've been helping us. So if they want to
Do one more question, if there's another question.
I'm kind of hoping for another big flood and then I'll go back. I left in one benchmark per each of our sites that we monitored for 4 years so that I could try to do a resurvey if we got another big flood before the paper was published, but it's been a pretty quiet water year or 2 since 2023.
So in terms of sampling, did you develop like a protocol that you're following to sample, or is it something from the literature that you're using to make sure you have representative samples from the population of plastics there? Because when you do manual sampling, you could miss some of the samples out there, plastics out there. So is it like a really
So we had to come up with for the 24 stream reaches where we did the greater than 5 centimeter plastics, we had to come up with a sampling protocol because there wasn't anything in the literature that was doing anything close to what we've done. We've shared that with other researchers now. So if people publish, well, they can't publish before I do because we already have. But so hopefully other people will adopt it and it will become a standard. But so the reaches were chosen for a whole host of regions, and then within each reach, the 5 or so transects were designed to be geomorphically representative. So we kind of walk the reach, do a sketch map of the reach, and then say, do we want to just, if it's a very uniform reach, do we want to just make them even intervals, right? Or if there's a wood jam in the reach, we want to have one of our transects hit the wood jam because we know that that's something that's interesting. Do we, if we want to try and get both a pool and a riffle, if there is, you know, part of the reach is unconfined and another part of the reach has a bluff or has revetment, we want to sample both of those things. So we would thought carefully about sort of building out the representative nature of our sampling. And my original hope was that we could use the sketch maps to then actually scale up from like our transects to the reach scale in a geomorphically representative way. The undergrads are not great at geomorphic sketch maps. So that is, you know, in the best laid plans. And that's, okay, 2021, I have a 6-month-old and suddenly I'm running this crew of like 8 undergrads. It was a little chaotic and we're very, very happy with the data set we did collect, but there were plans to really kind of scale up that we had to overcome.
Thank you. And our next seminar series, I know we mentioned drones today, it's about drones. It's on 11/17 and it's from Paige Bruchot with the Spatial Analysis Lab, and it's about leveraging GIS and drones to map floods and protect public health. So a little bit similar to today, but thank you, Anne, for your presentation today.
Thanks for having me.
Staff.